In this video, we will show you how to install your left front axle. Let's get started. Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. The first thing you need to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Make sure you have the suspension hanging. After that, you're going to remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Next, we can move along to our outer tie rod end nut. To remove this, we'll use a 15mm socket. Start that on just a couple threads. Now we'll continue on with a hammer. We're going to give the knuckle a couple loving bonks right along this area to try to cause some vibration to shake the outer tie rod end free from it. Let's move along to removing our axle nut. To remove this nut, use a 32mm socket. Use a hammer and punch, come right in the center of that axle and drive it out of the wheel bearing. We only want to break it free. Let's continue on underneath the lower control arm. We're going to remove our 24mm ball joint nut. Now we can continue on separating the ball joint from the lower control arm. Typically for this, you're going to want to cause a little bit of vibration to be able to break this free. When you do it, be extremely careful not to damage the ball joint boot. Once it feels as though it's broken free, carefully get in between the control arm and gently pry it down. After you've done that, we're going to grab onto this knuckle and pull it away from the hole where the ball joint sits in. Now we can release pressure from our bar. Continue on by pulling on the knuckle and pulling the axle out of the wheel bearing. The next thing that I always like to do is use a safety strap or a bungee cord. We're going to go right around that axle and then bring it up so it holds onto the strut or something the like. Essentially, so when we break the axle free, it can't come down and potentially hurt us. Before you continue removing the axle, make sure you put a collection bucket under the area where the axle goes into your transmission. Continue on with a pry bar between the axle and the transmission. Gently separate the two. All right, so now that we have it broken free, let's make our way back into the wheel well. I'm going to take off my safety strap and then carefully remove the axle from the vehicle. There it is, friends. The next thing you want to do before you install your brand new axle is to clean and inspect the seal. If it looks like it's torn, worn, or damaged in any way, it's a good time to replace it. Still feels soft. I feel confident that'll seal up against the brand new axle. Let's grab that axle. All right, let's go ahead and install this axle. When we do it, you want to make sure you go in as straight as possible so you don't damage the seal as you get to this point of the axle. When you put it in, you might notice that it gets caught before it slides all the way in. That's due to this locking ring. If that's the case, just go ahead and shimmy it straight on in. Sometimes you can give the end a loving bonk with a rubber mallet. All right, as I was driving that in, I could hear an audible difference telling me that I bottomed out against the transmission. At this point, you want to reach all the way in closest to the transmission, grab onto that axle, and try to give it a tug. I want to pull it out. I want to make sure it does not pull out of the transmission. That feels good. Once that's secured, we're going to continue on down at the far end. You want to coat these splines with some copper never sees. You do not need to get copper never sees on your threaded area. Now we can take that axle and put it in position on the back of the bearing. We'll slide it all the way in and then get the lower control arm slid over that lower ball joint. Now it's time to put on the lower ball joint nut. We'll start this on and bottom it out. Once you have it snug, torque it to 111 foot-pounds. The next thing you need to do is put on the axle nut. This is going to be easiest with the vehicle close to the ground. You'll notice that I used a flat pry bar coming across the lug studs, being extremely careful not to damage them in any way. That's to prevent this from spinning while I try to tighten the axle nut. Now, when you tighten the axle nut, you need to make sure that you do it by hand. You can use a ratchet and your 32mm socket, snug it up, and then we're going to torque it. Install your outer tie rod end into the knuckle. Snug up the nut and then torque it to 35 foot-pounds. Once you have that torqued, the next thing you want to do is pay attention to the slot of the nut. Make sure it lines up with the hole in the stud. If it isn't, continue tightening your nut until the very next slot does. Slide your locking cotter pin into position and lock it down. Okay friends, now we can reinstall our wheel. Once you have it in place, continue on by putting all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts on. Once they're started, bottom them out. We'll get the wheel safely back on the ground and then torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. Now that we have the car back together, it's going to be time to run the vehicle and check your transmission fluid. This is the transmission dipstick right here. It tells you exactly what type of fluid you should use. Now with the vehicle running on a flat level surface and warm, you want to go ahead and carefully pull out the dipstick. Once you have it out of there, give it a little wipe. Once you have it cleaned down, you want to pay attention to the dipstick itself. You'll notice on the dipstick you have 2 little dots, and in between those dots there's a hatched area. That's where the fluid level should be at when the transmission fluid is warm. Anywhere inside the hatched area is good. Below it means you need a little bit more, and above it means you need to actually remove some. Typically you will be low, so when you add, only add up into the hatched lines. Once you're sure you're in the proper position, make sure you re-secure the oil dipstick. Once you're sure the transmission fluid is at the proper level, make sure you reinstall your dipstick. Okay friends, we fully installed our front axle. At this point, you want to take your vehicle for a road test. Make sure the transmission shifts fine and you don't hear any funny noises. Aside from that, get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.